Margaret Hale pressed both hands flat against the boarding house door and pushed. It didn't open. Behind it, she could hear the woman inside moving the creak of floorboards, the clatter of a dish, and she knocked again, harder this time. "I heard you the first time," the woman called back. "We don't have rooms for your kind." The rain had already soaked through Margaret's coat. She stood there with her suitcase at her feet and the whole town watching from dry windows. And she did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears only gave people something to feel good about. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel. Follow Margaret's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain came sideways by the time Margaret Hale reached the far end of Red Willow Creek's main street. She had walked the full length of it twice now, once when she first stepped off the stagecoach, once after the boarding house turned her away, and both times she had kept her chin level and her steps deliberate. Because she knew people were watching, and she had long since decided that she would not give them the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. Red Willow Creek, Wyoming, 1878. It was a town that smelled like cattle and sawdust, and the particular kind of ambition that frontier towns carried before they figured out whether they would survive or disappear. A main street with a general store, a post office, a church whose white paint had started to peel, a saloon that never seemed entirely closed, and a scattering of wooden buildings that leaned into one another the way tired men lean against a fence at the end of a long day. Margaret had been through worse towns. She told herself that as the rain hit her face. She had also been through towns where she had known people, where someone would have recognized her name and offered her a cup of coffee and a dry place to sit. Red Willow Creek was not one of those towns. Red Willow Creek was a town she had come to precisely because nobody here knew her name. Or so she had believed. She stopped in front of the general store, not because she intended to go in, but because the short overhang above the door cut some of the rain. She set her suitcase down beside her feet and pressed her fingers together inside her wet gloves, and tried to think. She had enough money for perhaps 2 nights in a boarding house and a few meals. She had her skills bookkeeping, primarily, along with a working knowledge of inventory management, and enough medical understanding to handle minor injuries and common fevers, learned from years of necessity rather than formal training. She had her reputation. That last part was the problem. She heard the store door open and turned. The man who came out was short and broad through the shoulders, with a mustache that had gone gray at the edges and eyes that moved across her face with a specific kind of calculation. She recognized immediately the calculation of a man who already knew something about her and was deciding how to use it. "You the Hale woman," he said. Margaret held his gaze. "I am Margaret Hale, yes." He nodded as though that confirmed something he'd been hoping to deny. "Thought so." Description matched. He tucked out his thumbs into his belt. "I'm going to ask you plain, miss, and I'd appreciate a plain answer back. You worked for Garrett Simmons up in Cheyenne?" The name landed like a stone, dropped into still water. Margaret felt the ripple move through her, but she kept her face steady. "I did," she said, "and you left under circumstances." "I left," Margaret said, "after I discovered that Mr. Simmons was falsifying his cattle records to defraud 3 separate land buyers. And I reported what I found to the county land office. Mr. Simmons then used his considerable influence to ensure that the story people heard was a story entirely. That is what happened. You may believe whichever version you prefer." The man stared at her for a long moment. "Either way," he said finally, "I can't have you in my store." He went back inside and let the door close behind him. Margaret stood there in the rain. She picked up her suitcase. She walked. The truth was that she had known, even before she arrived, that there was a chance this would happen. She had known because it had already happened in Laramie. In Casper, in the small town of Elbow Bend, whose name she had almost laughed at until she spent 3 miserable days there, trying to find someone who would hire a woman with Garrett Simmons's name attached to her record. What she had not fully understood, not in a way that lived in her body rather than just her mind, was how quickly it happened. How a man she had never met could hear her name and look at her the way that store owner had looked at her. How completely a lie could travel ahead of the truth and arrive first, settle in, put down roots, so that by the time the truth showed up, it was already treated like the intruder. Garrett Simmons had been thorough. She had to give him that. He had sent letters. She'd discovered this later, letters to land offices, to merchant associations, to the kinds of civic organizations that kept records of who was trustworthy and who was not. The letters said that Margaret Hale, formerly employed as a bookkeeper, had been dismissed for falsifying records herself. That the investigation she had supposedly triggered was in fact an attempt to deflect suspicion from her own activities. That she was, in the polite language he favored, a woman of questionable character and undependable word. The letters were beautifully written. Garrett Simmons had always been a man who understood the power of language. Margaret had seen one of them, once. A sympathetic clerk in Laramie had shown it to her, with the expression of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. And she had read it twice all the way through, very carefully, and then handed it back without saying anything. She thought about that letter now, walking through the rain, and she thought about all the people in all the towns who had read it and believed it. And she decided, as she had decided before, as she kept having to decide again, that she was not going to let Garrett Simmons determine what she did next. She was 28 years old. She was soaking wet. She had $7.40 in her coat pocket and a suitcase with a broken latch that she kept closed with a length of rope. She was not done. She turned her face away from the rain and kept walking. She nearly walked past the ranch hand without seeing him. He was standing at the edge of the street near a hitching post, holding the reins of a brown horse with the patient, unhurried posture of a man who had nowhere particular to be and was content with that fact. He was older, somewhere past 50, with a weathered face that had spent decades outdoors, and a kind of stillness to him that Margaret had learned to associate with men who had made peace with hard work. He looked at her suitcase. He looked at her face. "Boarding house turn you away?" he said, not unkindly. Margaret stopped walking. The rain was louder between the buildings, drumming against the wooden storefronts. "It did," she said. He nodded, the way men nod when something confirms what they already expected. "Eliza Crum runs that house. She doesn't take chances on strangers." He paused. "Especially female ones who show up alone, I noticed," Margaret said. He looked at her for a moment longer, not the calculating look the store owner had given her, but something different, something that reminded her, unexpectedly, of the way her father used to look at a piece of land before deciding whether it was worth working. "Where are you planning on going?" he said. Margaret looked down the street. "Into the rain. I haven't decided yet," she said. That was the honest answer. The less honest answer, the one she didn't say, was that she didn't have anywhere to go. The money she had would get her to the next town, maybe, but the next town would have heard the same story. Or if it hadn't heard it yet, it would. Garrett Simmons had been thorough. The man beside the horse scratched the back of his neck. "I work out at the coal ranch," he said, "about 3 miles north. Nathan Cole's outfit. He's been looking for someone to help with the books. The supply records have gotten behind, something terrible. And he's not a man who trusts himself with numbers." He said this last part with what might have been the beginning of a smile. "He's a fair man, decent, and he doesn't listen much to what people say about other people." Margaret looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He shrugged. The gesture was so uncomplicated that she almost smiled herself. "Because it's raining," he said, "and you've got a suitcase and nowhere to go. And I know a place that needs someone." He held out his hand. "Name's Burl Pickett. I've been driving cattle for Nathan Cole going on 12 years. Margaret shifted her suitcases to her other hand and shook his. "Margaret Hale. I know," he said. "I heard your name from the store. Sound carries in this town." She waited for the rest. For the look, for the slight withdrawal. It didn't come. Well, Miss Hale, Burl Pickett said, untying his horse from the post. I'm headed back to the ranch now. You're welcome to ride along if you want work. Entirely your choice. Margaret looked at the rain. She looked at the town that had already decided what it thought of her. She picked up her suitcase. All right, she said. She did not tell Burl Pickett her history on the ride out. He didn't ask for it. They rode in a comfortable quiet that surprised her. She had expected questions, had prepared herself for them, had arranged her answers in the careful order she'd learned to arrange them, leading with the facts and letting the facts speak for themselves. But Burl seemed content to ride without talking, occasionally pointing out a landmark or naming a distant hill. And by the time they reached the gate of the coal ranch, Margaret had begun to let something in her shoulders loosen very slightly. Then she saw the house. It was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure exactly what she had expected, something more prosperous. Perhaps, given that Burl had described Nathan Cole as a fair man with a working outfit. What she found was a house that had clearly been well built. Once by someone who cared about the work, but that had in recent years been maintained rather than tenanted. There was a difference. Maintained meant the roof didn't leak and the windows held their glass. Tended meant someone noticed when the porch step was warping and fixed it before it broke. Meant flowers in the window box or a swept path to the door. The porch step was warping. The window boxes were empty. The path needed sweeping. He manages, Burl said, as though he'd read her assessment. Since his wife passed. He manages. How long ago? Margaret asked. 3 years. Maybe 4. Burl swung down from the horse. He's got a daughter. Lily. She's 8. Margaret climbed down, holding her suitcase. And there's no one, she started. There's me and the 2 other hands, Burl said. We're not much use with a child. He tied his horse to the fence post and gestured toward the house. Come on then. I'll introduce you. Nathan Cole was not what she'd pictured. Either. She had pictured someone older somehow, more worn down. A man who had been managing alone for 3 or 4 years, and who managed, as Burl said, but didn't thrive. She had expected that to show in his face the way neglect showed in his house. He was standing at the work table in the main room when they came in, bent over a ledger book with a pencil in his hand, and the particular posture of a man who is not comfortable with what he's doing, but is doing it anyway. He was perhaps 35, maybe a year or 2 older, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that showed the kind of work that couldn't be faked. When he looked up, his eyes moved to Burl first and then to Margaret, and they were steady, brown, careful eyes that gave very little away. This is Margaret Hale, Burl said. She's looking for work. I told her you've been behind on the supply records. Nathan looked at her. Not the calculating look, not the suspicious look, just a look. Direct and unashamed, the way a man looks at a horse he's considering. Except without the condescension that comparison implied, because there was something in his eyes that was also measuring and respectful at the same time. You do books, he said. I do, Margaret said. References? She had been waiting for this. She had her answer prepared, the careful version, the one that laid out the facts without volunteering the complications. Before she could deliver it, Burl said, She'll give you references in the morning. Nathan. It's raining sideways out there, and the boarding house turned her away. Nathan looked at Burl. He looked back at Margaret. He looked at her suitcase, which was dripping onto his floorboards. There's a spare room, he said. At the back. It was used for storage, but there's a bed frame in it. He paused. The mattress is decent. I don't want charity, Margaret said. I'm not offering charity, he said, with a directness that matched his eyes. I need someone who can make sense of 4 months of supply receipts before I go any further into debt trying to figure out where my money went. If you can do that, you've got a job and a room. If you can't, I'll drive you to the next town myself. Margaret looked at the ledger on the table. From where she stood, she could see the columns, or what should have been columns, and were instead a collection of numbers that had wandered across the page without any apparent system holding them together. Those are supply receipts, she said. Mostly, he said. She set her suitcase down. I'll need a separate sheet for each supplier, she said. And I'll need to know which of these entries are for cattle feed versus equipment. And I need to know which months you're missing records for. Because those numbers don't add up to anything comprehensible. There was a pause. Tomorrow, he said. Tonight, she said. If I'm going to start work, I'll start work. He looked at her for a moment, and something moved behind his careful eyes, not admiration exactly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man who had expected to have to argue and found there was nothing to argue about. Burl, he said, show Miss Hale where the lamp oil is. She worked until past midnight. There was a child in the house, Lily, who Margaret did not see that first night because she was already asleep when they arrived, and Margaret was conscious of keeping quiet. Moving softly through the room while Nathan sat across the table and answered her questions about which receipts belonged to which quarter and which supplier it had delivered short on 2 different occasions. He was a good informant. He knew his own operation. Knew it with the intimate knowledge of a man who had built it himself and watched every piece of it, even when he couldn't translate that knowledge into numbers. She asked a question, and he answered without hesitation. And she wrote down what he told her, and by 11 o'clock she had a structure that made sense. And by midnight she had identified the problem. You've been overpaying your grain supplier, she said, and underpaying yourself for 2 seasons of cattle delivery. Someone has been recording your outputs at below market value. Not by a lot, just enough that it wouldn't catch your eye if you weren't looking for it. Nathan put down the coffee cup he'd been holding. Who? He said. I don't know yet, she said. I need to cross-reference the delivery records against the payment logs. Do you have those? In the box under the table, he said. She looked at him. You've been sitting at this table for how long? She said. A few weeks, he said. And the box under the table. I didn't know what I was looking for, he said, without defensiveness. Just the plain fact of it. Now I do. She pulled the box out. She opened it. Inside was a collection of receipts and letters and delivery confirmations that had been placed in the box in roughly chronological order, which was at least a beginning. She looked at the stack and then looked at Nathan Cole, who had turned his coffee cup in his hands and was watching her with that steady, careful gaze. This might take several nights, she said. I'm not going anywhere, he said. It was such a simple thing to say. She couldn't explain later why it affected her the way it did. She turned back to the papers and kept working, and she didn't let him see her face for a moment, because something in her expression had gone briefly unsteady in a way she didn't want to explain to a stranger. She met Lily the next morning. The girl appeared in the doorway of the main room at first light, dressed in a nightgown with her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her father's careful eyes in a smaller, more openly watchful face. She looked at Margaret, who was still at the table with the papers spread around her and the lamp burning low. And she did not say anything. Good morning, Margaret said. Lily looked at the papers, looked at Margaret, looked at the coffee pot on the stove, which was empty. Papa doesn't wake up until the coffee's ready, she said. I know how to make coffee, Margaret said. Papa makes it with 3 scoops, Lily said. Not 2. 2 tastes like water. 3 scoops, Margaret said. She got up and made the coffee with 3 scoops, and Lily sat across the table and watched her in the specific way that children watch adults. They are not yet sure about cataloging, assessing, reserving judgment in a way that adults often lost the habit of. Are you going to stay? Lily asked. For a while, Margaret said. Burl brings people sometimes, Lily said, and they mostly don't stay. Why not? Lily thought about it with the seriousness of someone who had genuinely considered the question. Papa's quiet, she said finally. People think quiet means unfriendly. It doesn't. No, Margaret agreed. It doesn't. The coffee was ready. Nathan Cole appeared in the doorway, still half asleep, hair worse than the night before, pulling his suspenders up over his shoulders, and looked at the table. Looked at his daughter, looked at Margaret. 3 scoops, Lily reported. Good, he said. He poured himself a cup and sat down. And for a few minutes, the 3 of them sat at the table in the early morning, quiet. And it was, Margaret thought, one of the strangest and most ordinary moments she had experienced in a very long time. The trouble started on the 4th day. She had known it was coming. She'd felt it building in the way that storms build in the changed quality of the air, in the way people in town cut their eyes away when she accompanied Burl on a supply run, in the specific silence that fell over 2 women talking outside the post office when they saw her coming. What she hadn't anticipated was how it would arrive. She was in the stable she had taken to helping with the horses in the mornings because she genuinely liked the work, and because it gave her a reason to be outside, and because the ranch hands had begun to accept her presence without comment, which she valued more than she'd expected to when she heard Burl's voice from the yard, strained in a way that his voice almost never was. She came out of the stable and saw him standing near the gate, talking to a man on horseback. The man on horseback was someone she had never seen before. He was well dressed in the way that men who want to be taken for ranchers sometimes dress, the boots too new, the hat too deliberate, and he had the specific kind of handsome face that had been useful to him, and that he knew it. He was not looking at Burl. He was looking at Margaret. And he was smiling. Well, he said in a voice that carried without effort. I heard you'd come this way. Margaret walked forward until she was standing beside Burl. She kept her hands loose at her sides. Mr. Dawson, she said. Clarence Dawson. He had worked for Garrett Simmons's operation as a contract manager, not one of the men who did the actual work, but one of the men who stood between the work and the accounting, which was exactly where he needed to be to make the numbers say whatever Simmons wanted them to say. He had testified when the county land office conducted its brief and largely pointless investigation that he had never seen Margaret Hale produce any document that suggested wrongdoing on Simmons's part. The land office had found his testimony credible. Margaret had stood in that room and listened to him lie with perfect sincerity, and had understood, for the first time, what she was actually up against. Miss Hale, he said pleasantly. Small world. What are you doing here? She said. Passing through, he said. I'm working out of Cheyenne these days. Have some interests in this area. He looked around the yard at the stable, at the house at the fence line. Nathan Cole's outfit. Isn't it? Good ranch. Struggling some from what I hear. It's doing fine, Burl said. Is it? Dawson's eyes came back to Margaret. I heard there was a new woman helping with the books. Figured it might be you. He tilted his head, you know. You really shouldn't go around telling people you're a bookkeeper. Miss Hale. Given your history, given my history, Margaret said. I am exactly qualified to be a bookkeeper. That's one way to see it. He smiled again. The other way, of course, is that you're a woman who got run out of Cheyenne for falsifying records, and you've landed yourself in a situation where you have access to another man's finances. He paused. Just long enough I'd hate for Mr. Cole to find out the hard way. Burl made a sound beside her, low, involuntary, the sound of a man trying not to say something he'd regret. Margaret looked at Clarence Dawson's and felt the old familiar weight of it, the weight of a lie that was better constructed than the truth, that had more power behind it, that had already had years to settle into people's minds and become solid. I think you should go, she said. I think you're right, he agreed pleasantly. I just wanted to say hello. He touched the brim of his hat. You have a good day, Miss Hale. He turned his horse and rode back through the gate. Burl stood beside her until the sound of hoofbeats faded. You know him long? He said. Long enough, Margaret said. He's going to go into town. I know. He's going to talk, I know, she said again. She looked at the gate for a moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the house. Because there was still work to do, and she had learned that work was the only answer she had ever found to the particular kind of fear that had settled in her chest just now, the fear not of what might happen to her, but of what might happen to The people who had been kind enough to let her in. Nathan found out that afternoon. She didn't know who told him. It might have been Burl trying to prepare him. Or it might have been one of the other hands who had gone into town for supplies and come back with more than flour. It might have been any of the townspeople who had been watching her for days with the cautiousness of people waiting for their suspicions to be confirmed. She was at the table still working, always working. Because the more she found in the records, the more there was to find when he came in and sat down across from her without saying anything for a moment. She looked up. "There's something I should tell you," she said. "There's something you should tell me," he agreed. So she told him. Not the careful version, not the arranged version, the real version. The whole thing, from the beginning. Garrett Simmons and the fraudulent land sales. The records she had found and copied and brought to the county land office. The investigation that went nowhere because Simmons had friends in the right places. The letters he had sent. The name she had carried since then. From town to town, that arrived everywhere ahead of her. She told him about Clarence Dawson, and what Dawson had said that morning, and what she understood Dawson's presence in the area to mean. She told him all of it, with her hands flat on the table and her voice steady, because she had decided, somewhere in the past 4 days, that if this was going to fall apart, it was going to fall apart on the truth, not on some partial version she'd constructed to protect herself. When she finished, Nathan was quiet for a long time. The lamp between them burned. Outside the wind had picked up, and she could hear it against the walls of the house. "The record's under the table," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "You said someone's been undervaluing your cattle deliveries. 2 seasons worth," she said. "It's consistent enough to be deliberate." He looked at the papers between them. "And you think Dawson is connected to that," he said. She hadn't thought of it that way. She had been so focused on Dawson as a threat to her position here, as the man who would take away the one place she'd found, that felt almost stable, that she hadn't put those two things together until just now. She looked at the records. She looked at the timeline she had constructed over the past 4 days. The undervaluing had started approximately 14 months ago. She thought about what Dawson had said. "I'm working out of Cheyenne these days. Have some interests in this area." "Yes," she said slowly. "I think he might be." Nathan looked at her. "Then we have a problem," he said. "And I want to be clear about something." She waited. "The problem," he said, "is Dawson, not you." Something moved in her chest that she didn't have a name for. "You don't know me," she said. "I've been here 4 days. I know what I've seen in 4 days," he said. "And I know what I'm looking at in these records. And I know that a woman who was skimming money wouldn't spend 3 nights finding the evidence of someone else doing the same thing to me." He paused. "That's not complicated math, Miss Hale." She looked down at the papers. She was not going to cry. She had not cried in 2 years. Not since the night she had sat alone in a room in Cheyenne, reading Garrett Simmons's letter for the second time. And she was not going to start now. "The town will say things," she said. "The town says things about everyone," he said. "I've been ignoring what the town says about me for 4 years. It's different," she said. "What they'll say about me will reflect on you, on the ranch, on Lily." He was quiet for a moment. "Let me worry about that," he said. "Nath, let me worry about that," he said again. And his voice was so completely without drama or performance that it landed with more weight than if he'd shouted it. "You do the records. I'll deal with the town." She looked at him across the table, this quiet man, with his careful eyes, and his warping porch step, and his daughter who had told her that quiet didn't mean unfriendly, and she thought that she had met a great many people in the past 2 years, in the past 28 years, and very few of them had ever made her feel, so simply and without ceremony, that she was worth the trouble of defending. She turned back to the records. "I'll need 2 more days," she said. "Maybe 3. "Take what you need," he said. And they sat together at the table, while the wind pushed against the walls of the house. And she worked, and he stayed, and neither of them said anything more about what it meant that he was still sitting there at all. On the 6th day, Lily Cole got sick. It started in the morning: a cough, a fever, the particular glassy look in a child's eyes that meant her body had turned inward to fight something. By midday the fever had climbed, and by late afternoon it had climbed further, and Nathan had come in from the field with a tightness around his mouth that Margaret recognized as the specific fear of a man who had already lost one person and understood, in a way that went past thought into something deeper, that he could not afford to lose another. The nearest doctor was 12 miles away. The storm that had been threatening for 3 days had finally arrived: real weather. The kind that turned roads to mud and made a 12-mile ride, something different from what it had been that morning. Nathan stood in the doorway of Lily's room. "I'll go for the doctor," he said. "I know what to do," Margaret said. He looked at her. "I have some medical knowledge," she said. "Not a doctor's training, but practical knowledge. I've managed fevers like this before." She kept her voice level. "Tell me what she's taken previously, any medicines." "How long ago?" he told her. She listened. She went to her suitcase, the one with the broken latch, and found the small kit she always carried. Because she was a woman who traveled alone and had learned what that meant. She worked through the evening. She managed the fever with cool cloths and the careful, patient repetition of bringing the temperature down and keeping it down. She sat beside Lily's bed and talked to the girl when she was awake about nothing in particular. About horses and books, and the way snow fell differently in different parts of Wyoming, and she held her hand when the fever spiked again near midnight, and Lily reached for something to hold onto without knowing what. Nathan stayed in the doorway. He came in twice to look at his daughter's face. And each time he looked at Margaret, and each time she told him honestly where things stood, which was that the fever was high but not rising, that the girl was fighting it well, that she needed the night to pass. The night passed. By morning Lily's fever had broken. She lay in her bed, pale and hollow-eyed and exhausted, and she looked at Margaret, who was still sitting in the chair beside her, and she said, "You stayed all night." "I did," Margaret said. Lily said. Margaret thought about the honest answer to that question. She thought about all the versions of it. "Because you needed someone to," she said. Lily was quiet for a moment. "Papa was scared," she said. "I know he doesn't show it," Lily said, "but his hands do. When he's scared, his hands do this." She made a gesture. Fingers pressing together. "He does that when he's scared." "I noticed," Margaret said. "Did you know," Lily said, and her voice had the tentative quality of a child approaching something important sideways, "that you're the first person who stayed in the spare room for more than 2 days?" "Burl mentioned that," Margaret said. "The last lady Burl brought," Lily said, "left because she said it was too lonely." "Is it lonely?" Margaret said. Lily thought about it. "It was," she said. "It's not as much now." She looked at Margaret with her father's careful eyes. "Are you going to leave?" Margaret looked at the window. The storm had passed in the night, and the morning outside was the particular clear, washed quality of a morning after hard weather, everything scrubbed clean. The light hitting differently. "I don't know yet," she said. It was the honest answer. Lily seemed to accept it with a seriousness that suggested she understood what it meant. "Okay," she said, and then, as though this settled something, 3 scoops, 3 scoops, Margaret agreed. She got up to make the coffee. And Nathan was already in the doorway, with his hands pressed together and the look in his eyes of a man who had stood outside a door all night listening, and who was not entirely sure what to do with what he felt. "She's all right," Margaret said. He nodded, his hands relaxed. "I know," he said. "I heard her." He stepped back to let her pass. And she passed him in the doorway, close enough to see the tiredness in his face and the relief underneath it. And she thought that this quiet man with his careful eyes had spent a night being afraid, and had not once asked her to carry that fear for him or perform against it. He had simply let her work and trusted her to, and she understood without being told that this was not something he did easily. She went to make the coffee. He went to sit with his daughter. And the morning came into the house, clean and new. and for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember. Margaret Hale did not think about the town, or Clarence Dawson, or Garrett Simmons, or any of the names that followed her. She thought only about the 3 scoops, and the chair beside the bed, and the particular quality of a morning after a hard night, when the worst had passed, and what remained was simply the fact of still being there. Lily's recovery was slow in the way that children's recoveries sometimes are 2 steps forward. 1 step back, the fever returning briefly on the second night before breaking for good on the 3rd morning. Margaret stayed close through all of it, not because Nathan asked her to. He didn't ask. That was the thing about him she kept noticing. He did not ask for things he felt he had no right to ask for. He simply moved around the edges of whatever she was doing and made it easier without calling attention to the fact that he was doing it. He made sure the lamp oil was full when she worked late. He left a plate of food near the papers without comment. He checked on Lily himself in the deep hours of the night so that Margaret could sleep for a few hours in the chair without worrying that the girl would need something and find no one there. She noticed all of it. She noticed it and said nothing, because saying something would have required them to look directly at a thing they were both, for different reasons, not ready to look at directly. On the 4th morning, after the fever broke, Lily ate a full breakfast and announced that she was bored. Nathan looked at Margaret across the table with an expression that was so close to relief it was almost funny. And Margaret felt something move through her that she hadn't felt in a long time, something light. Something that did not weigh anything. Something that might, if she let it, become laughter. She didn't let it. But she thought about it for most of the morning. Burl came in from the yard while they were still at the table and set his hat on the hook by the door, with the deliberate care of a man who has something to say and is figuring out how to say it. "There's talk in town," he said. Nathan didn't look up from his coffee. "There's always talk in town. This is different talk," Burl said. "How different?" Margaret said. Burl looked at her. He had the good grace to look uncomfortable. "Dawson's been at the saloon 2 nights running. Talking to people. The kind of talking where he buys a round and then mentions something and lets it sit and buys another round." He paused. "People are repeating it." "What are they repeating?" Nathan said. Burl was quiet for a moment. "That Miss Hale's been stealing from your records. That's why she was run out of Cheyenne, and that's why she ended up here to do the same thing again." The table was very quiet. Lily, who had been eating in the focused way of a child working through a bowl of oatmeal, looked up. She looked at Burl. She looked at Margaret. Her 8-year-old face did the same calculating assessment it always did. The same cataloging that had startled Margaret the first morning. "That's not true," Lily said. "No," Burl said gently. "It's not. Then why is he saying it?" Nobody answered that immediately. Because the honest answer, because lies are easier to spread than truths, and some men understand that, and use it, was not a simple thing to explain to an 8-year-old, or to anyone. "Because he has a reason to," Margaret said finally. "And the reason isn't about me." Nathan looked at her. "The records," he said. "The records," she said. She had finished the cross-referencing 2 days ago. She hadn't brought it to Nathan yet, because Lily had been sick and the timing had felt wrong. You didn't sit a man down with financial evidence of a long-running fraud while his daughter was running a fever in the next room. But she had the numbers. She had built the case from the papers in the box under the table, from the delivery records and the payment logs and the supplier invoices, and what the numbers said, laid out in their proper sequence, was damning. "How bad?" Nathan said. "Over 14 months, she said. You've been underpaid for cattle delivery to the tune of roughly $430. The undervaluing is consistent, never the same amount twice, but always within a narrow range that would be invisible unless you were looking at it all at once." She paused. "Someone who knows how to work with numbers did this deliberately. It's too consistent to be error." Nathan's jaw moved. "That's nearly half a year's operating income." "I know," she said. Burl had gone very still by the door. "Can you prove it?" Nathan said. "I can show you the pattern," Margaret said. "Whether a judge considers that proof depends on what other evidence exists. But yes, I can build a document that shows exactly what happened. Entry by entry." Nathan was quiet. The kind of quiet that was not absence of thought, but the opposite of it, a man thinking very hard, very fast, behind still eyes. "Dawson's name is on any of those records," he said. "Not directly," she said. "The payments run through a land management company called Meridian Holdings. I don't know yet who sits behind that company." "I might," Burl said from the door. Both of them looked at him. Burl's expression had settled into something that was harder than his usual openness. "Meridian Holdings came up about a year ago. They've been acquiring grazing rights in this area, small pieces. Nothing that catches attention by itself. But I've been watching the pattern." He picked up his hat and turned it in his hands. "Clarence Dawson's brother-in-law is a lawyer in Cheyenne. Name of Featherstone. He set up Meridian." The silence that followed was the kind that meant everyone in the room was arranging what they knew into the shape it made when put together. "He's not just passing through," Margaret said. "No," Burl said. "I don't think he ever was." Nathan pushed back from the table. He stood up. He walked to the window, not to look out. Margaret had noticed he did this when he was thinking. Stood near the window, without focusing on anything beyond it, and he stood there for a moment, with his hands at his sides. "He's here for the land," Nathan said. "And he needed you short of money to make selling it feel like the only option," Margaret said. "That's why the underpayments started 14 months ago. Long enough to feel like a pattern you couldn't fix. Long enough to put you in a position where selling a portion of the grazing rights would look like sound management." Nathan turned from the window. "And you showing up here," he said, "was bad timing for him." "Very bad timing," she said. "Because I know how this kind of accounting works. I know what it looks like when someone's been manipulating records. Because I've seen it done before." She let that sit for a moment. "That's why he came here. That's why he's been in the saloon. He needs me gone before I finish what I've already started." Lily had stopped eating. She was watching the adults around her with the particular attention of a child who understands that something serious is happening, even if not all the words make sense. "Is he going to make you leave?" she said. Margaret looked at her. "Not if I can help it," she said. It was not a promise. She was careful, always, not to make promises she couldn't guarantee. But she said it with enough steadiness that Lily seemed to accept it, and turned back to her oatmeal, and the table breathed again. Nathan looked at Margaret. "Finish the document," he said. "I need 2 more days," she said. "You have them," he said. "I'll deal with what's happening in town," Nathan, she started. "I'll deal with it," he said again. And he picked up his hat from the hook, the one beside Burl's, and went out the door. And Burl followed him, and Margaret sat at the table with Lily and the papers, and the cold remains of her coffee, and understood that she was in the middle of something that had gone well past bookkeeping. She pulled the papers toward her and kept working. 3 days. She needed 3 days and a clear head, and she would have everything Nathan needed to take to a lawyer. After that was a question she was not going to answer yet. She worked, the town talked, she kept working. By the afternoon, 2 of the neighboring ranchers had ridden out to speak to Nathan. She could hear their voices from the yard, not the words. Just the tone, the particular flat-footed quality of men delivering a message they'd been given by someone else and were not entirely comfortable with. Nathan's voice in response was quieter, but she could hear its steadiness from inside the house. And she thought that whatever he was saying it with the same absence of performance that characterized everything he did. The men left. Nathan came back inside and poured himself coffee without saying anything. Margaret did not ask. He did not volunteer. After a moment, Lily said, "What did Mr. Hargrove want?" "To give me some advice," Nathan said. "What kind?" "The kind that's not for me," he said. Lily seemed satisfied with that. Margaret turned back to her papers. But she had seen his face when he came in, and there was something in it, not fear, not anger exactly, but the tightened look of a man who has just been told something he already knew and doesn't like knowing more the second time. And she understood that whatever Hargrove had said, it had included her name. She did not ask. She would not ask. She had learned in the past 2 years that asking people to defend themselves for the cost of defending her was a form of taking something she had no right to take. She worked faster. That evening, after Lily was in bed, Nathan sat across from her at the table and said, without preamble, "Tell me about before Simmons." She looked up. "Why?" she said. "Because I've been thinking about it," he said. "I've been thinking that I know the story that started with Simmons, but I don't know the part before, and I'd like to." She put the pencil down. She thought about the versions of the answer. The careful version. The partial version. The version that started with the facts and left the feelings out. "I grew up in Ohio," she said. "My father was a schoolteacher. My mother died when I was 11. I learned numbers from my father because there wasn't money for much else, and because I had a mind for them. When he died, I was 21. I went west because there was more work for a woman who could keep books on the frontier than in Ohio, where everyone had an uncle who needed the position." She paused. "I worked for 3 different outfits before Simmons. Good men, fair pay. I was good at what I did and I knew it. And Simmons hired me because I was good at it," she said. "He wanted someone who could find inconsistencies in his suppliers' records. He didn't tell me, when he hired me, that he was also creating inconsistencies in his buyers' records." She was quiet for a moment. "When I found it, I didn't find it all at once. It was like your supply records. Little things that didn't add up, and then more little things. And then one night I laid it all out together and saw the whole shape of it." "What did you do?" "I copied everything I could copy," she said. "And I took it to the county land office in Cheyenne. And then I went to work the next morning as though nothing had happened, because I needed to keep access to the records until the investigation started." She looked at her hands on the table. "I underestimated how fast Simmons moved. He had the story out before the land office had finished reading my file. By the time anyone came to ask me questions, half the town had already decided what the answers were." Nathan was quiet. "You weren't frightened," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "I'm still terrified, if you want the honest answer. Every town I come to, I'm terrified that this is the one where something I can't fix catches up with me." She hadn't meant to say that last part. It came out because it was late, and she was tired. And he was sitting across from her, asking questions with his honest, careful eyes, and she was not practiced at being dishonest with people who asked her honestly. "Are you frightened here?" he said. She looked at him. "Not of you," she said. "Not of this house," she paused. "Of Dawson. Of what he'll do when he realizes the records are almost finished." Nathan nodded slowly. "I want you to know something," he said. She waited. "What Hargrove said today," he said. "He told me I should ask you to leave. That having you here was going to cost me business relationships I couldn't afford to lose. That even if you were innocent of everything they were saying, the association was damaging." He looked at his coffee cup. "He said it as a friend. He wasn't about the risk." "I know," she said. "I told him no," Nathan said. She looked at him. "I know," he said, answering the question she hadn't asked. "I know what it might cost. I'm not asking you to account for it." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had made his decision the way he made every decision, quietly and without ceremony, and with the full weight of what it meant. "You should know," she said, "that I will finish these records and give you everything you need. And if you decide after that it would be better for you and Lily if I moved on, I will understand that. I know you would," he said. "That's not what I'm asking." "Then what are you asking?" He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to stop assuming the worst outcome," he said. "I'm asking you to stay the night and wake up tomorrow and keep working. That's all." It was the simplest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. She didn't know how to answer something that simple, so she didn't try. She picked up her pencil. He refilled his coffee. They sat together at the table until past midnight. And outside the window, the Wyoming dark was very complete. And the house was quiet, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all. She finished the document on the 7th day. It was 23 pages of the most careful accounting work she had ever done, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because she understood that the only weapon she had ever had against Garrett Simmons and men like him was precision. You could not argue with numbers that were laid out correctly. You could try, but the numbers themselves pushed back. She placed the finished pages in front of Nathan at the breakfast table and stepped back. He looked at the first page, turned to the second. Read carefully, the way a man reads something he doesn't want to misunderstand. By the time he reached the 5th page, Burl had come in for the morning and was reading over his shoulder. And by the 8th page, Nathan put the papers down and looked at her with an expression she didn't immediately know how to categorize. "This is everything we need," he said. "For a civil case?" "Yes," she said. "For a criminal case, you'd need a lawyer to advise on what else is required. But this is the foundation." Burl straightened up. "I know a lawyer in Cheyenne," he said. "Good man. He's handled cases like this." "How quickly can you reach him?" Nathan said. 3 days' ride, Burl said. 4 with the roads the way they are. "Go tomorrow," Nathan said. Burl nodded. He picked up his hat and went out, and they heard him calling to one of the other hands in the yard. Already making arrangements, already moving, with the purpose of a man who had been waiting for something to do. Nathan looked at the papers again. "You could have left," he said. "A week ago. Any day this week. I could have," she said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about the answer, not the performed version of it. Not the practical version, the true one. "Because someone spent a year stealing from you," she said. "And you deserve to know about it, and have it documented properly." And because she stopped, because he said. She looked at her hands. "Because Lily asked me if I was going to leave," she said. "And I told her not if I could help it. And I meant it." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "She's been talking about you," he said, "when you're not in the room. She told me you knew how to make coffee right." Margaret felt the corner of her mouth move. 3 scoops, she said. "She said you stayed up all night when she was sick," he said. "That when she woke up scared at 2 in the morning, there was someone there. The table was very quiet." "She should always have that," Margaret said. "Someone there when she wakes up scared." Nathan looked at his hands. The same gesture Lily had described, fingers pressing together. The involuntary tell of a man feeling something he doesn't know how to say. "My wife," he started and stopped. Margaret waited. "She died in the winter," he said. "Fever, same as Lily had last week. I was out with the cattle, and by the time I got back," he stopped again. "I've been afraid of fever ever since. Any time Lily gets so much as a cold." He pressed his hands flat on the table. "I don't manage it well." "You managed it fine," Margaret said. "I stood in a doorway all night," he said. "That was managing it," she said. "You didn't leave. You stayed close, and you let me work, and you didn't make it harder. That's not nothing." He looked at her. There was a moment between them that was different from the ones before it, not less careful. But careful in a different way. The way you are careful with something I recognize as valuable, rather than something you're simply trying not to break. Then Lily's voice came from the hallway, "Is the coffee ready?" And the moment shifted, settled back into the ordinary shape of morning, and Nathan got up to pour his daughter a cup, and Margaret gathered the papers from the table and organized them for Burl to take to Cheyenne. And the day moved forward the way days do, carrying everything that had happened in it, like water carrying whatever falls in. The trouble she had been expecting arrived 3 days later. It came not as Dawson himself. She had half expected him to ride into the yard again, to try once more with his pleasant smile and his careful calibrated threat, but as something she hadn't anticipated, which was always the way the worst things came. It was a woman named Clara Finch, who ran the Church Women's Auxiliary and who had, by Margaret's reckoning, been the first person in town to formally organize opinion against her. She arrived at the ranch in the company of two other women, all three of them in their good visiting clothes, all three carrying the expression of people who have convinced themselves they are doing someone a kindness. Nathan was out with the cattle. Margaret was alone in the house with Lily, who had gone back to her lessons at the kitchen table. She opened the door herself. Clara Finch looked at her with the sympathy of a woman delivering bad news she is personally glad to deliver. "Miss Hale," she said, "I'm glad we found you in. We've come to speak with you directly, because we feel you deserve that much." Margaret stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. They came in, they sat. Margaret did not offer coffee. "The town has concerns," Clara Finch said, "about your presence here, about the influence you may be having on Mr. Cole and his daughter." "What kind of influence?" Margaret said. "A woman in your position," Clara began. "What position?" Margaret said. "I am employed as a bookkeeper. I live in the spare room. I have kept the ranch accounts, and I cared for Lily when she was ill." "What position are you referring to?" Clara Finch's expression adjusted itself. She had prepared for argument and found something sharper than she expected. "Your reputation," she said more carefully. "There are serious questions about your character that Mr. Cole may not be fully informed about." "He is fully informed," Margaret said. "He knows my history. He knows what happened in Cheyenne. He knows Clarence Dawson's name and the reason Dawson is in this area. And he has made his decision about my employment accordingly." The three women exchanged a look. "You understand," said the second woman, whose name Margaret didn't know, "that people's concerns extend beyond employment." "You mean they're concerned that I might marry him," Margaret said. The directness of it landed like a flat stone. Clara Finch's cheeks colored slightly. "We are concerned," she said, recovering, "about a young motherless child, and the kind of example Mrs. Finch." Margaret kept her voice level. "I stayed beside that little girl through 2 nights of high fever because she needed someone there and I was there. I have kept her father's accounts with enough accuracy that we have documented a year-long fraud being committed against this ranch. I have done nothing, since I arrived here, that a person of any character, male or female, would not do." She paused. "If you have specific concerns about specific actions I have taken, I am happy to discuss them. If you have come here to deliver an opinion based on a story that Clarence Dawson is circulating because I found evidence of his crimes in these records, I am asking you to leave." The silence that followed was the particular silence of people who had not expected to be spoken to this way and were deciding how to respond to it. Lily at the kitchen table had gone very still. Clara Finch stood up. The other two stood with her. "I can see," Clara said, with the clipped dignity of a woman who is losing but refuses to acknowledge it, "that you are quite settled in your position." "I am," Margaret said. "I hope, for Mr. Cole's sake, that your position is what you say it is." "So do I," Margaret said. "And I hope, for Mr. Dawson's sake, that a good lawyer in Cheyenne doesn't look too closely at Meridian Holdings. But I suppose we'll see." She showed them to the door. She closed it behind them. She stood with her hand on the door for a moment, breathing carefully. "You told them to leave," Lily said from the table. "I did," Margaret said. "Clara Finch doesn't get told to leave anywhere," Lily said. She sounded less shocked than impressed. "Papa doesn't even tell her to leave." "I know," Margaret said. "Are you scared?" Lily said. Margaret turned from the door. She looked at this 8-year-old girl with her father's eyes and her mother's absence and her own particular kind of courage. And she thought about the honest answer. "A little," she said. "But sometimes you have to say the thing that's true, even when it's scary. Otherwise, the thing that's false gets to stay." Lily considered this with great seriousness. "Like the records," she said. Margaret looked at her. "The false numbers," Lily said. "If nobody finds them, they stay there and look true. Exactly like the records," Margaret said. Lily nodded, as though something had been confirmed that she had already suspected. She turned back to her lessons. Margaret went back to the table and picked up her pencil. And the house was quiet again, and outside the Wyoming afternoon moved through its ordinary business of light and wind, and the sound of cattle in the far field. But Margaret kept her pencil very still for a moment before she started writing, because something had shifted today. Something had been said out loud that had not been said before, and the saying of it had made it real in a way that was frightening and clarifying in equal measure. She was not leaving. She had not decided it. Or she had decided it without knowing she was deciding it. The way you sometimes cross a line without feeling the moment your foot lands on the other side. She was not leaving, and Clarence Dawson knew it, and Clara Finch knew it now. And tomorrow Nathan would come back from the field, and she would tell him what had happened. And whatever came next would come next. She put the pencil to the paper. She kept working. Nathan came back from the field that evening with mud on his boots and the particular tiredness of a man who had spent a day doing physical work, while his mind was somewhere else entirely. He came through the door and looked at Margaret's face and stopped. "What happened?" he said. She told him. All of it, Clara Finch. The two women she'd brought with her, the conversation at the door, what she'd said about Meridian Holdings. She told it plain, without softening the parts that might worry him or sharpening the parts that had frightened her. Just the facts in order, the way she always told things. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You mentioned Meridian Holdings to her," he said. "I did. She'll tell Dawson." "I know," Margaret said. "I weighed that before I said it. But she was going to tell him something regardless. And I decided I'd rather he know that we know than have him think he's still operating in the dark." Nathan looked at her. "That was a calculated risk," he said. "Yes," she said. "A good one," he said. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected him to tell her she should have stayed quiet. Should have let Clara Finch say her piece and leave without engaging. Most men would have said that. Most men operated on the assumption that a woman in a precarious position should make herself small and wait. "You're not angry," she said. "Why would I be angry?" he said. He pulled off his coat and hung it on the hook. "You told the truth. You told it to the right person at the right moment. If Dawson knows we have the records documented, it changes what he can do next. It also speeds up whatever he's planning," she said. "It does," Nathan agreed. "Which is why I'm going to ride into town tomorrow morning." She looked at him. "By yourself," she said. "I've been going into town by myself for 4 years," he said. "I think I can manage." "That's not what I mean," she said. "I mean, what are you going to do there?" He sat down at the table and looked at her steadily. "I'm going to talk to people," he said. "Not all of them. The ones who matter. Jim Alderman at the land office. Pastor Wells, because Wells has more common sense than Clara Finch will ever have, and people listen to him. And Frank Meade at the bank, because Meridian Holdings has been buying grazing rights with borrowed money, and Frank will want to know if that collateral is connected to a fraud case." Margaret stared at him. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "I've been thinking about it all day," he said. "I just needed to know what happened here first." He paused. "Lily told me Clara Finch got told to leave." "Lily talks too much," Margaret said. The corner of Nathan's mouth moved in a way she was beginning to recognize. "She said you told them that the false numbers had to be found, or they'd keep looking true." Margaret looked at the table. "She understood it," Nathan said. "She's 8 years old, and she understood the whole thing." He was quiet for a moment. "She also said you told her you were a little scared, but you said it anyway." The house was very quiet. "I did," Margaret said. "So did I," Nathan said. He pressed his hands flat on the table, the gesture Lily had named, the one that meant he was feeling something, and he looked at Margaret with the direct, unhurried steadiness she had come to understand was not distance but the opposite of distance. Was in fact the closest thing he had to an open door. "I'm going to go into town tomorrow and tell the truth loudly enough that it doesn't get buried. And I need you to stay here and be safe while I do it." "I don't need protecting," she said. "I know you don't," he said. "I'm asking anyway." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. He nodded once and got up to wash the field off his hands. And the ordinary rhythms of the evening reasserted themselves. And dinner was made and eaten, and Lily went to bed, and the lamp burned low on the table. and nothing that had been said between them was taken back. She lay awake for a long time that night, not from fear or not only from fear, from something harder to name, the specific unsettlement of a person who has spent 2 years building walls in the right places and has begun, without quite deciding to take them down. She was not practiced at this. She had been practiced at it once, before Cheyenne. Before Simmons, she had been a woman who trusted people with reasonable speed and recovered from betrayal with reasonable resilience and did not spend entire nights calculating the exact depth of her vulnerability. That woman had been efficient and functional and had also, it turned out, been standing on ground that could be pulled away without warning. She was not sure she wanted to be that woman again. She was not sure she could avoid it. Nathan went into town at first light. She heard him leave the sound of his horse in the yard, the gate, the diminishing hoofbeats, and she lay still for another few minutes and then got up and made coffee with 3 scoops and started her day. Lily came out for breakfast and immediately said, "Where's Papa Town?" Margaret said. Lily absorbed this. "Is he going to fix things? He's going to try," Margaret said. "Papa's good at fixing things," Lily said. "He fixed the fence himself when one of Hargrove's bulls knocked through it. Hargrove offered to pay for a man to do it and Papa said he'd handle it." She paused. Reflective, "He handles most things himself." "I know," Margaret said. "He doesn't usually let other people help," Lily said. And she looked at Margaret with the sidelong quality of a child making an observation that is also a question. "He let you help." Margaret set a plate in front of her. "Eat," she said. Lily ate, but the observation hung in the air between them. Fully delivered. Nathan had been gone for 2 hours when the rider arrived. Margaret heard the horse in the yard and came out from the main room to see a young man she didn't recognize 20. Maybe, with a hired hand look and the slightly winded posture of someone who had covered ground quickly. He had a folded paper in his hand. "Miss Hale," he said. She stopped. "Who's asking?" she said. "Mr. Dawson asked me to deliver this," he said, and held out the paper. She took it. The young man wheeled his horse and left without waiting for a response, which told her he'd been paid to deliver and not to stay, which told her something about what was inside. She opened it. The handwriting was Dawson's. She had seen enough of it in the manipulated records to recognize the particular controlled precision of it. The hand of a man who understood that how something was written communicated as much as what was written. "Miss Hale, I am writing as a courtesy, which I hope you will receive in the spirit it is intended. The document you have prepared for Mr. Cole is, I understand, quite thorough. I am prepared to acknowledge certain accounting irregularities and to make appropriate restitution a settlement, handled privately, that would satisfy Mr. Cole's legitimate financial concerns without the considerable disruption of a legal proceeding. In exchange, I ask only that the matter of Meridian Holdings not be brought to the attention of the County Land Office or any associated legal authority. This arrangement would serve everyone's interests, including your own. A legal proceeding would, of necessity, require examination of your own history in some detail. I don't think either of us wants that. Please advise Mr. Cole of this offer at your earliest convenience." She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original crease and set it on the table and went back to the records she had been cross-checking. And she sat down and picked up her pencil, and she put it down again because her hand was not quite steady. He was threatening her. That was what the last paragraph was. Wrapped in the language of mutual consideration, but the meaning was clear. Take the settlement and go away quietly, or he would use his resources, and she did not doubt that he had resources to make her legal history a centerpiece of whatever court proceeding followed. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about sitting in the county land office in Cheyenne 2 years ago, with her copied records in a folder on her lap, waiting for a clerk who looked at her with the wary expression of a man who had already been told what to think. She thought about the investigation that had lasted 11 days before being quietly closed. She thought about walking out of that building into the Cheyenne afternoon and understanding for the first time what it meant to have done the right thing and lost anyway. She had lost that time. She was not going to lose this time. Not because of courage, or not only because of courage, because she was tired. 2 years of tired. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been careful and guarded and strategic, and has watched a lie travel faster than the truth in every direction she turned. She was finished being careful about Clarence Dawson's comfort. She picked up her pencil. She wrote at the bottom of his letter, in her clear bookkeeper's hand, Mr. Cole will be making his own decisions about legal proceedings. I am not in a position to advise him to act against his interests. M. Hale. She set the letter on the table where Nathan would see it when he came back. Then she went back to work. Nathan returned in the early afternoon. He came through the door with a different quality to him than he'd had when he left, not lighter exactly, but resolved in a way he hadn't been that morning. The posture of a man who has done something and knows what he did was right. He saw the letter on the table. He read it. He read it again. He set it down. When did this come? He said. She told him. She told him what the writer had looked like, how quickly he'd left, what she had written at the bottom. Nathan looked at her response at the bottom of Dawson's letter. You didn't ask me before you wrote that, he said. No, she said, I didn't. He was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. She hadn't realized how much tension she'd been holding, waiting for his response until it released. How did it go in town? She said. He sat down. He had the focused look of a man organizing a report. Jim Alderman at the land office already had questions about Meridian Holdings, he said. He'd been watching the grazing rights acquisitions, and something about the pace of them had bothered him. When I showed him the summary pages from your document, he went very still and then asked me if he could keep a copy. You gave him one? She said. I gave him the pages that dealt with the delivery underpayments, he said. Not the full document. I kept the full document. Good instinct. She had not taught him that he already knew it. What did he say he'd do? Write to the Territorial Land Commissioner, Nathan said. He said, if what your document shows is accurate, and he seemed to think it was, then Meridian Holdings has been acquiring grazing rights using fraudulently obtained capital, which makes every transaction they've completed potentially voidable. Margaret sat back. That was larger than she'd calculated. She had been focused on Nathan's specific losses, the $430. The underpayments, the direct fraud. She had not fully traced the implications outward to what it meant for every other rancher in the area who had sold or leased rights to Meridian. How many properties? She said. Alderman thinks 7, Nathan said. Maybe 8. All small pieces. All ranchers who were under some kind of financial pressure when Dawson's people approached them. His jaw tightened. Same method, different targets. We weren't the only ones he was bleeding. The room was very quiet for a moment. He sent me a letter, she said. I know. I read it. Nathan looked at the paper on the table. He's frightened. That's what this is. He's trying to buy time, she said. He's trying to cut his losses, Nathan said. If he can get us to settle privately, the land office never looks at the full picture. He keeps whatever he's already built with Meridian and loses only what he can't hide. He paused. I talked to Frank Meade at the bank. And Meridian Holdings borrowed money against the grazing rights they've acquired, Nathan said. Frank didn't know the rights might be fraudulently obtained. Frank is not an emotional man, but he was emotional about it. Those loans represent a significant portion of the bank's current lending. So the bank has an interest in pursuing this, she said. The bank has a very strong interest in pursuing this, Nathan said. Frank is going to demand a full accounting from Meridian Holdings by the end of the month. If Dawson can't produce one, he can't, Margaret said. Not one that holds up. Then the bank calls the loans, Nathan said. And whatever Dawson built here falls apart. She thought about the shape of it. The whole construction, the gradual underpayments. The fictitious land company, the borrowed money, the grazing rights acquired at below-market rates from ranchers who'd been financially pressured to sell. It was elegant in a repulsive way. It was exactly the kind of scheme that Garrett Simmons had run in Cheyenne, adapted for a frontier land market. She wondered if they knew each other. She thought they probably did. "There's one more thing," Nathan said. His voice had changed slightly. She looked at him. "Pastor Wells," he said. "You talked to him." "I did." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "He told me Clara Finch came to him this morning. Before I got to him. She told him what happened at the house yesterday, her version of it." He paused. "He said she was not as sympathetic to her own account as she apparently intended to be. Despite everything." Margaret felt something move through her that was almost amusement. "He's a perceptive man, Pastor Wells," she said. "He is," Nathan said. "He told me that in his experience, the people a town was quickest to condemn were most often the people a town most needed. He said he'd be preaching on that Sunday and that he'd be making the general point in a manner that anyone paying attention would understand." She looked at him. "He doesn't know me," she said. "He knows me," Nathan said. "And he knows that I have not once in 4 years acted against the interests of this community. And I told him plainly that you were honest and that the stories about you were engineered by the same man who has been defrauding ranchers in this area for over a year." She looked at her hands on the table. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," he said. It was not dramatic. It was the same quiet plainness he brought to everything. It was the truth. The truth should be said. She thought about what she had told Lily 2 days ago. The false numbers had to be found, or they'd keep looking true. She had said it to a child about accounting records. But Nathan had just said the same thing about her. In a town that had already decided what it thought, to a pastor who would carry it forward. She did not trust herself to speak for a moment. The sound of Lily coming down the hallway saved her. The girl appeared, in the doorway, with a book tucked under her arm and the alert expression of someone who had been listening for at least part of the previous conversation. "Is Dawson going to be arrested?" she said. "Lily," Nathan said. "I heard the letter part," she said unapologetically. "Is he?" "That depends on a number of things," Margaret said. "Lawyers, and what the land office decides, and whether the bank cooperates. But he might be," Lily said. "He might be," Nathan said. Lily digested this with satisfaction. "Good," she said, and went to the table with her book. And the word landed with such simple finality that neither adult could think of anything to add to it. That evening after supper, while Lily read, and Nathan worked on a harness repair at the other end of the table, Margaret took out a fresh sheet of paper and began drafting a supplementary summary, a cleaner version of the key evidence, organized for a legal audience rather than an accounting one, with citations to specific records and page numbers. She had been working for about an hour when Nathan said, without looking up from the harness, "You don't have to do that tonight." "I know," she said. "You've been working for 8 days straight." "I'm almost finished," she said. "Margaret." He said her name in the particular way he had, not as a correction, not as a command, just her name, used directly, which was somehow more effective than either. She stopped writing. "The document is done. Burl has the copy in Cheyenne. Alderman has the summary pages. The work is done." She looked at the paper in front of her. "I keep thinking I missed something," she said. "You didn't," he said. "You don't know that." "I know that you've checked it 4 times," he said. "I've been watching you check it." She looked at him. He had set the harness down and was watching her with those steady eyes that gave very little away and communicated everything. "I'm not good at stopping," she said. "I noticed," he said. "You don't stop because you're afraid that if you stop something will fall apart." She held his gaze. "That's an accurate assessment," she said. "Things aren't going to fall apart," he said. "Not tonight." She looked at the paper for another moment. Then she put the pencil down. "What did your wife do?" she said. "When you worked too late." She had not planned to ask it. "It arrived the way things arrived when you were tired, and your guard was down directly." without the careful packaging you would normally apply. Nathan was quiet for a moment. She'd come stand in the doorway, he said. She wouldn't say anything. She'd just stand there until I looked up. He paused. I always looked up. She sounds patient, Margaret said. She was, he said, more patient than I deserved. There was grief in his voice, but the old kind, not the raw grief of recent loss, but the grief that has been lived with long enough to become part of the landscape. She would have liked you, he said. She had no patience for people who ran from hard things. She always said the people who run from hard things cause twice as many problems for everyone else, because the hard things don't go away. They just get bigger. Margaret thought about that. I never ran, she said. I know, he said. That's what I mean. She looked at him, across the table, this man who had opened his door on a rainy night without knowing anything about her, who had sat across from her through 8 evenings of work and given her the truth when she asked for it and the space she needed when she didn't ask for anything, who had gone into town that morning and said her name in a context of honesty and trust, 2 people who had already decided what her name meant. She did not say what she was thinking. It was too new, and she did not trust new things yet. But she thought it, and she let herself think it, which was further than she had let herself go in 2 years. She picked up her book and stepped inside, which was the closest she could manage to stopping for the night. And Nathan picked up the harness again, and Lily turned a page, and the lamp burned steady between them all. The knock came the next morning before breakfast. Hard, purposeful knocking, not the neighborly kind, not the visiting kind, the kind that announces itself as official before the door is open. Nathan opened it. 2 men stood on the porch. One was Jim Alderman from the land office, which was not a surprise. The other was a man Margaret had never seen, mid-50s, broad through the chest, with a badge pinned to his coat and the practiced stillness of a man who has learned to enter situations without escalating them before he understands them. Nathan, Alderman said. This is Deputy Marshal Kane. He rode in from Cheyenne last night. We need to talk. Nathan stepped back from the door. They came in. Margaret was at the table with the coffee and the papers. Deputy Marshal Kane looked at her, and then at the papers, and then at Nathan. This Miss Hale, he said. It is, Nathan said. Kane looked at her steadily. Ma'am, I understand you prepared the accounting document that Mr. Alderman sent to the commissioner's office. I prepared a document for Mr. Cole's records, Margaret said. Mr. Alderman received a summary. The commissioner received the full thing by courier yesterday evening, Kane said, along with a letter from Mr. Alderman and a separate letter from the First Territorial Bank of Red Willow Creek. He paused. The commissioner has authorized a formal investigation into Meridian Holdings and its associated parties. I am here to execute that authorization. The room was very still. You're here to arrest Dawson, Nathan said. I'm here to locate Mr. Dawson and certain financial records associated with Meridian Holdings, Kane said, with the careful legal precision of a man who had learned to say exactly what he meant and not one word more. Do you know his current whereabouts? He's been staying at the hotel in town, Nathan said. Kane nodded. He looked at Margaret. Your document? Ma'am, the accounting you did. Would you be willing to appear before a territorial judge to authenticate it and explain your methodology? She had been asked something like this once before, in Cheyenne by a different official in a different office, and the answer she had given in good faith had not been enough to carry the weight of what Garrett and Simmons could push back with. This was different. She could feel it was different in Alderman's presence, in the bank's involvement, in the deputy marshal, who had ridden through the night to stand in Nathan Cole's kitchen at breakfast time. Yes, she said, I would. Kane looked at her for a moment with an expression that shifted slightly, not warmth exactly, but something like professional respect, the look of a man who has been told a story about someone and is finding the story doesn't match the person. You were at Simmons's operation in Cheyenne, he said. She stilled. The commissioner's office has that investigation on file, Kane said. The one that was closed 11 days in. He paused. The commissioner reviewed it last night, alongside your current document. He made some observations about the methodology used in both cases. She didn't breathe. The Cheyenne investigation is being reopened, Kane said. That's not my assignment, but I was asked to inform you. The room was absolutely silent. Lily, who had appeared in the doorway at some point in the previous minutes and had been standing very still, said, "Does that mean they know she didn't do anything wrong?" Kane looked at the child. "It means they're looking harder at who did," he said. Lily looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Lily and at Nathan, and at the two men standing in the off a ranch house in Red Willow Creek, Wyoming, and she thought about 2 years of carrying a name that didn't belong to her, of walking into towns that had already made up their minds, of keeping her back straight and her chin level and her voice steady when every part of her wanted to put her head down and simply stop. She thought about the letter she had written at the bottom of Dawson's settlement offer. She thought about Nathan saying, "It was the truth. The truth should be said." She pressed her hands flat on the table to keep them still. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." Kane nodded. He and Alderman took their leave with the efficiency of men who had more work to do before the day was over. And Nathan closed the door behind them and turned around. And he looked at Margaret with an expression she had not seen on him before, not the careful steadiness, not the quiet assessment, but something more open than that. Something that had gotten past the careful part. "Margaret," he said. "Don't," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "Give me a moment." He gave her the moment. She sat at the table and pressed her hands flat and breathed through it, through 2 years of it. Through the weight of everything that had accumulated behind the careful walk from town to town. Through the letter she had read in Cheyenne. Through every door that had been closed, and every room that had gone quiet when she entered it. She breathed through all of it, not because it was over, it wasn't over. There was still a judge, still testimony, still a legal process that could go any number of ways, but because something had shifted this morning, that was real and solid and not going to be taken back. Someone had looked at what she did and seen it correctly. Lily crossed the room and sat down beside her at the table. Not touching her, not saying anything, just sitting close in the way that children sometimes do when they understand that presence is what's needed, and words are not. Nathan poured 3 cups of coffee. He set them on the table. He sat down 3 scoops, Lily said into the quiet. It was such an absurd and perfect thing to say that Margaret put her face in her hands and made a sound that was partly a laugh, and partly something else entirely. And when she looked up, Nathan was watching her with the most unguarded expression she had ever seen on his face. Something open and certain and unhurried. Something that had been building for 8 days, and that both of them had been careful not to name. He did not look away. She did not look away. And Lily drank her coffee with both hands and watched them, not looking away from each other, and said nothing at all, which was, for Lily, quite remarkable. Outside, somewhere on the main street of Red Willow Creek, Deputy Marshal Kane was looking for Clarence Dawson. And whatever happened next in the courthouse, in the Territorial Commissioner's office, in the reopened file from Cheyenne, was going to happen with Margaret Hale's name attached to the truth for the first time in 2 years. It was enough for this morning. It was more than enough. Clarence Dawson was not at the hotel when Deputy Marshal Kane arrived. His room was paid through the end of the week. His belongings were still there, a leather travel bag. A second coat, a shaving kit arranged on the washstand, with the precision of a man who cared about appearances. But Dawson himself was gone, and the hotel clerk could not say exactly when he had left, only that he had not come down for breakfast, and the bed had not been slept in. Burl brought this information back to the ranch by mid-morning, riding fast, with the particular expression of a man who has heard something that changes the shape of a situation. "He ran," Nathan said. "Looks that way," Burl said. Margaret stood at the table and thought about what it meant. A man who runs confirms everything. A man who runs leaves his carefully constructed story behind with no one to maintain it. without Dawson in Red Willow Creek to keep the pressure on, to buy rounds at the saloon and plant his careful doubts, the story he had built about her would begin to lose its architecture. Stories needed tending, lies especially. "Does Kane know?" she said. "He knows," Burl said. "He's sent word to Cheyenne and to 3 other offices between here and the territorial border. Dawson won't get far without being recognized." "His brother-in-law," Margaret said. "Featherstone in Cheyenne, the lawyer who set up Meridian Holdings." Burl looked at her. "What about him? If Dawson ran, he ran toward the person who could help him most. Featherstone will know every legal mechanism available to slow this down, to complicate it, to make the investigation take long enough that witnesses lose patience and evidence gets questioned." She paused. "Kane needs to know that. I'll ride back into town," Burl said. "Go now," Nathan said. Burl went. Nathan looked at Margaret across the room. "You thought of that faster than the marshal did," he said. "I've been living inside this kind of thinking for 2 years," she said. "It's not cleverness, it's familiarity." He studied her for a moment. "Does it bother you?" he said. "That he ran? That you won't get to face him directly?" She thought about it honestly. The way she had learned to think about things since being in this house without performing the answer she was supposed to give. "A little," she said. "I wanted him in a room with the records. I wanted someone with legal authority to put the numbers in front of him and watch him try to explain them." She paused. "But he running is also an answer. It's the answer a guilty man gives when he knows the evidence is real." "It is," Nathan said. "The town will see it that way," she said. "The town is already seeing it that way," he said. Burl said 3 people stopped him on the main street this morning before he even reached the hotel. All of them wanting to know if it was true that Dawson had been running a fraud operation against local ranchers. She looked at him. "Not about me," he said. "About the fraud. About Meridian Holdings." He paused. "When people understand that the person they were warned against was actually the persons who uncovered what was beyond to them, the conversation changes." "Not always," she said. "No," he agreed, "not always. But sometimes." He looked at her steadily. "This is one of the sometimes." She turned back to the table. She still had work to do. She had begun drafting a cleaner version of the supplementary summary for the territorial judge, and the legal language required precision she couldn't rush. But something in the room had shifted slightly, the way rooms shift when news arrives and rearranges the furniture of what everyone had been assuming. She sat down and picked up her pencil. Nathan pulled on his coat. "I'm going to check on the north fence," he said. "Then I'm going to ride over to Hargrove's and tell him what we know." She looked up. "Hargrove," she said. "The one who told you to send me away." "The same," Nathan said. "He's a neighbor. He'll want to know that Meridian Holdings approached him 6 months ago about leasing grazing rights. Because I know they did, because he mentioned it at the time. If the investigation goes the direction it's going, he'll need to have talked to someone official." He picked up his hat. "Besides, he deserves to hear it from me." She watched him settle the hat on his head with the unhurried competence of a man who has worn hats in all weather and has long stopped thinking about it. "Nathan," she said. He looked at her. "Why are you going to Hargrove?" she said. "The real reason." He held her gaze. "Because he told me to send you away. And I didn't. And I want him to know why I didn't." The simplicity of it settled into the room. She turned back to her papers. "Don't be late for supper," she said. She heard something in the pause that followed something that was not quite a sound. Just the quality of a man's stillness before he moves. Then the door opened and closed, and she was alone with the papers and the lamp, and the particular silence of a house that is not empty even when no one is in it. He was back by mid-afternoon. She heard him in the yard, heard him speak to one of the hands, heard his boots on the porch step. He came in and hung his hat and coat and sat down across from her with the look of a man who has covered ground, not just physical ground. "Hargrove," she said. "He was quiet for a long time," Nathan said. "Then he said he owed you an apology." She stopped writing. "He said he'd been repeating what Dawson told people without asking whether it was true, Nathan said. He said he does that sometimes, picks up the opinion of whoever talked to him last. And it's a fault he's trying to correct. He paused. He asked if you'd come to his place Sunday. His wife wants to meet you. Margaret set her pencil down very carefully. His wife, she said. Ellen Hargrove, Nathan said. She apparently told him he was a fool from the beginning. She told him that any woman who sat with a sick child through 2 nights of fever and then went back to work the next morning without asking for credit was not the kind of woman those stories described. He paused. Her words, according to John Hargrove, who repeated them in the exact tone of a man who has realized his wife was right and is coming to terms with it. Margaret looked at the table. I'll go Sunday, she said. I thought you would, he said. She looked up. You were confident of that. I was confident, he said. That you wouldn't let pride keep you from doing the thing that needed doing. You never have before. It was such a direct thing to say that she felt it move through her in a way she hadn't prepared for. She looked at him, this man, who watched everything with careful eyes and said the true thing without decoration, and she thought that she had known a great many people who spoke well and meant less than half of it, and very few who spoke plainly and meant everything. Thank you, she said, for going there. Don't thank me for telling the truth, he said. I've told you before, it doesn't require thanks. Then thank you for going first, she said. Before I had to go myself. Something moved in his face. That one I'll accept, he said. He got up and poured himself coffee and brought the pot to refill her cup without asking, which was a thing he had started doing somewhere around the 5th day that she had never commented on but had noticed every time, and went back to the other end of the table where he had his own paperwork, ranch records, stock numbers, the ordinary arithmetic of a working operation, and they sat across from each other in the easy quiet that had become, without either of them formally deciding it, the natural condition of their shared space. Lily came home from her afternoon lesson at Pastor Wells's house. She was one of 4 children who received instruction there twice a week and came through the door already talking. Pastor Wells preached at Clara Finch, she announced. Nathan looked up. He preached at her. In front of everyone, Lily said, dropping her coat on the hook with the energy of someone delivering extremely satisfying news. He didn't say her name, but everyone knew because she was sitting right there and she went very red. Lily sat down at the table with the expression of a reporter who has witnessed something historic. He talked about how a community that believes a lie because the lie is convenient is not a community that deserves the truth. And he talked about how the person a town rejects is sometimes the test of what that town actually is. She looked at Margaret. He was talking about you, she said. Everyone knew. Lily, Nathan said mildly. They did, Papa. Mrs. Alderman leaned over to Mrs. Meade and said he's talking about the Hale woman and Mrs. Meade said, I know, and Clara Finch ought to be ashamed of herself. You heard all of that, Margaret said. I hear most things, Lily said without apology. Clara Finch left before the final prayer. That's never happened before. Margaret looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at his coffee cup. Pastor Wells, he said, is a man of considerable precision. He is, Margaret agreed. Lily, satisfied that her report had been fully received, went to find her book, and the afternoon moved forward. And the house held all of it, the news from town, the conversation at Hargrove's, the marshal's investigation. The document on the table held all of it, with the solid quietness of walls that had been built to last. Burrell returned from town with 2 pieces of information. The first was that Deputy Marshal Kane had sent a telegraph to the Cheyenne office regarding Featherstone, and that the Cheyenne office had responded within the hour to say that the lawyer was already under observation as part of the reopened Simmons investigation. The speed of that response told Margaret more than the content did. It meant the Cheyenne investigation had been further along than anyone had told her. Meant someone there had been building a case even while the official file was closed. Meant that what she had done 2 years ago had not, in fact, disappeared entirely. The second piece of information was that two ranchers who had sold grazing rights to Meridian Holdings had come to the land office that afternoon, asking questions. Jim Alderman had spent 3 hours with them, going over their own records. One of them, a man named Gus Pratt, whose family had ranched in the area for 20 years, had apparently said in the land office, with enough volume to be heard in the street, that whoever had uncovered the Meridian operation had done every rancher in the territory a service, and that he personally intended to say so to anyone who implied otherwise. Gus Pratt, Nathan said. He doesn't say much. When he says something, Burl said. People listen. The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn. She was not sure what woke her, some sound, or the absence of sound, or simply the particular alertness that came sometimes in the deep hours when her mind had been working while she slept. She lay still for a moment and then got up and went to the main room and sat at the table without lighting the lamp. She sat there in the dark and she thought about what came next. Not about the legal proceeding, she understood that well enough. Testimony before a territorial judge, her document entered into the record. Cross-examination by whatever lawyer Featherstone managed to send if Dawson was found. She was not afraid of that. She had the numbers, and the numbers were real. She thought about what came next for her. She had not let herself think about this. She had been so focused on finishing the work, on building the document, on making the case complete and unassailable, that she had kept the question of afterward in a sealed room and not opened it. But it was opening now, in the dark, before dawn, with the house quiet around her. She could leave after the testimony. She had technically fulfilled whatever obligation she had to Nathan's situation, more than fulfilled it. Had given him a documented case that would recover his losses and dismantle the operation that had been predicting on his ranch. She had done the work. She could go. She sat with that thought and noticed what it felt like. It felt wrong, not in the way that a bad decision feels wrong, but in the way that a wrong piece of information feels wrong when you're working with numbers, like something that doesn't fit the total, that contradicts what everything else in the set is telling you. She heard a sound from the hallway and looked up. Nathan stood in the doorway. He had clearly been awake. He was dressed, or mostly dressed, his shirt untucked, his feet bare, with the look of a man who had also been lying in the dark, thinking about things. He looked at her at the table in the unlighted room. He didn't say anything for a moment. Couldn't sleep, she said. Neither could I, he said. He came to the table and sat down across from her. And they sat, the dark together, which was in some ways more intimate than all the evenings they had sat across from each other, with the lamp between them and the work to focus on. You're thinking about leaving, he said. It was not a question. She looked at him. In the dark she could see the shape of him, the steadiness of him, but not the details of his expression. Maybe that made it easier. I'm thinking about what's next, she said. Which includes that as a possibility, he said. Yes, he was quiet. She could hear him breathing. Slow and deliberate, the breathing of a man choosing his words. I want to tell you something, he said. And I want you to let me finish before you say anything. She nodded. When my wife died, he said, I made a decision. I didn't make it on purpose. It wasn't the kind of decision you sit down and make. It was the kind that makes itself, slowly, without asking your permission. The decision was that I was done. That I had had one good thing and lost it, and that was the end of that part of my life. And that from then on I would take care of Lily and the ranch, and that would be sufficient. He paused. I believed that, he said. For 3 years I completely believed it. It felt true. It felt like the honest accounting of what was available to me. She waited. And then Burl brought a woman in out of the rain, he said. And she sat down at my table and looked at my ledger books and told me in about 4 minutes what was wrong with them. And she stayed up all night with my daughter and made coffee with 3 scoops and told Clara Finch to leave my house and built a legal case against a fraud operation in 8 days. He paused. And the accounting I'd done of what was available to me turned out to be wrong. She was very still. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight, Sai said. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now, but I wanted you to know that when you think about what comes next, about what the possibilities are, this is one of them. This house. Lily. He said it without drama, without performance. The way he said everything. That is a real possibility. I want you to know that. She looked at him in the dark. She thought about all the careful walls she had built. She thought about the ground that had been pulled away in Cheyenne and what it had cost her to stand up again afterward. She thought about trust and what it required and what it risked, and whether there was a version of a life where those two things could coexist without one destroying the other. She thought about a man who had said, "My door is open to a woman standing in the rain without knowing a single thing about her," and had not once, in 8 days, given her reason to regret walking through it. "I need time," she said. "You have it," he said immediately. No pressure, no wounded silence, just the same uncomplicated readiness he brought to everything. I don't move quickly toward things," she said. "I used to, I don't anymore." "I know," he said. "You don't know that," she said. "You've known me 8 days. I've watched you work for 8 days," he said. "You check everything twice. You don't commit to a number until you're certain it's right. You build the whole structure before you put your name on it." He paused. "I know how you move toward things." She looked at him. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, 3 scoops, which was possibly the most inadequate response available. And yet, it was what came out because she needed to say something that broke the gravity of the moment without dismissing it. He made the sound that she had come to understand was his version of a laugh, not quite a laugh. Something quieter, something contained, and the dark room was suddenly warmer. "Go back to bed," he said. "We have the Hargroves on Sunday, and Burl gets back from Cheyenne on Monday, and there's a great deal of ordinary life to get through." She stood up. "Nathan," she said. He looked up at her. "I heard everything you said," she said. "I want you to know that." "Good," he said. She went back to her room. She lay down and looked at the ceiling, and the thing that had been sealed behind a door in her chest moved around considerably before it settled. But when it settled differently than it had before, in a different configuration. Occupying slightly more space, she slept. Sunday came with the particular clarity of a late autumn morning, cold and clean-aired and decisive. Margaret put on her good dress. She had one. Navy wool, practical but not without dignity, and Nathan put on a clean shirt with his collar buttoned, and Lily wore the green dress she had strong opinions about, and they rode to the Hargroves together in the wagon, with Burl driving. Ellen Hargrove opened the door before they reached it. She was a broad-shouldered woman of 50, with a face that had spent a long time outdoors and a directness of expression that reminded Margaret, unexpectedly, of Nathan. She looked at Margaret with the forthright assessment of a woman who does not waste time. "Miss Hale," she said, "come inside. I've been wanting to meet you since the week you arrived, before my husband filled his head with other people's opinions." She said this loudly enough for John Hargrove, visible in the room behind her, to hear clearly. He had the posture of a man who had heard this observation before and was not going to argue with it. "Thank you," Margaret said. "I've been looking forward to this." Ellen Hargrove took her arm and drew her inside with the proprietary warmth of a woman who has decided something, and the decision was final, and everyone else might as well adjust. John Hargrove shook Nathan's hand, and then looked at Margaret and said, "I owe you an apology, Miss Hale." "You don't," she said. Dawson was convincing. He'd had practice. "I should have asked questions," Hargrove said. "I know Nathan. I know his judgment. When he kept you on, I should have trusted that over anything," Dawson said. He paused. "My wife told me so at the time." "I did," Ellen said. From the kitchen, without appearing. Hargrove accepted this without protest. They sat to dinner, a real dinner, the kind that took the whole table and involved more food than 6 people strictly needed. Because Ellen Hargrove cooked the way she did everything else, with complete commitment and no apology for the scale of it. Lily sat between Margaret and Nathan and ate with the focused pleasure of a child who appreciates a serious meal. There were other neighbors at the table, Gus Pratt and his wife Clara, a different Clara. She explained immediately, with the weary humor of a woman who has been making this distinction her whole life. Jim Alderman and his wife, Pastor Wells, who arrived late and sat at the end of the table and said grace with the ease of a man for whom this is ordinary rather than performance. The conversation moved away. Conversation moves at a table where people are relaxed and well-fed and have things worth saying. The investigation was discussed. Kane had confirmed that morning that Dawson had been located at the territorial border. Attempting to cross into Colorado, he was in custody. The Meridian Holdings records had been seized. Featherstone in Cheyenne had been brought in for questioning. Gus Pratt said, "I figure every rancher in this county owes Miss Hale something." His wife said, "We owe her and she's too polite to say so." Margaret said, "I kept the books because someone was stealing from Nathan." "That's all." "That's not all," Pastor Wells said. "From the end of the table, you kept the books accurately when an inaccurate set would have been safer for you." "That's the distinction." She looked at him. He had a minister's ability to say the precise true thing and then not explain it. "Let it sit." "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "I preach what I observe." Ellen Hargrove laughed at that. A full and generous laugh, and the table moved on. And the afternoon went the way the best afternoons go, without noticing the time until it has passed, leaving behind the specific warmth of hours that were used for exactly what hours should be used for. On the wagon ride back, Lily fell asleep with her head against Margaret's arm before they were a mile from the Hargroves. Margaret sat still so as not to wake her, and Nathan held the reins. And Burl rode ahead, and the road home was quiet and dark and easy. "She does that," Nathan said. "Falls asleep in transit." "I noticed," Margaret said. "She used to do it on her mother's shoulder," he said. "Same way." She looked down at the sleeping child. "I don't want to replace that," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not trying to be her mother. I'm not trying to fill something that shouldn't be filled." "I know," he said. "I just want to be someone she trusts," she said. "Someone who stays." He was quiet for a moment, handling the reins through a curve in the road. "She already trusts you," he said. She decided that somewhere around the second morning. "I could tell because she stopped watching you and started just being around you. There's a difference." Margaret looked at the road ahead. "Nathan," she said. "Margaret," he said. "I've decided," she said. He waited. She had not planned to say it tonight, had thought she needed weeks more. Had thought she needed the testimony to be over and the legal process to be settled, and all the practical complications resolved before she could look at the question clearly. But sitting in the dark with a sleeping child's weight against her arm and a good dinner behind her, and a man beside her who had not once, in all the time she had known him, made her feel that who she was a problem to be managed. She understood that she had actually decided days ago and had simply been conducting the review. "I don't want to leave," she said. He didn't move. The horse kept its pace. "All right," he said. "I want to stay through the legal proceedings. And after that I want to stay." She paused. "If that's still what you meant, what you said the other night." "It's still what I meant," he said. "It's exactly what I meant," she exhaled. "I need time," she said. "Even still, I need to come to things slowly. I'm not in a hurry," he said. "You're a patient man," she said. "I'm not particularly," he said. I know what this is, what it's worth. I'm not going to rush what's worth waiting for." She looked at him in the dark. He was watching the road, steady and unhurried, with the reins easy in his hands, and Lily's weight between them and the ranch ahead, and all its ordinary demands, the fence that still needed work, the supply records for next quarter, the north pasture that needed attention, before winter came in properly. She thought, this is it. Not the grand version, the real version. The daily version, the one that is built from 3-scoop coffee and staying up late, telling the truth, when it would be easier to stay quiet and sitting in the dark together without needing it to be something it isn't yet. This is what it is. She looked back at the road. Lily shifted in her sleep and pressed closer, and Margaret let her. And the wagon moved through the dark toward a house that had a lamp burning in the window, because Burl had ridden ahead and lit it. It was the most ordinary thing in the world. She had not known, until right now, how long she had been waiting for ordinary. The testimony was scheduled for the third Tuesday of November. Margaret had known the date for 2 weeks. She had prepared for it, the way she prepared for everything, methodically, thoroughly, checking each element twice, and then a third time, until the structure was solid enough that no unexpected question could find a gap in it. She had her document. She had her supplementary summary. She had the original delivery records and the payment logs organized by date and cross-referenced by supplier. She had, in short, everything a territorial judge would need to understand exactly what Clarence, Dawson, and Meridian Holdings had done to Nathan Cole and 7 other ranchers in the Red Willow Creek area. What she had not prepared for was the letter that arrived 4 days before she was scheduled to travel to Cheyenne. Burl brought it in from the post office with the particular care of a man who that some pieces of mail were more consequential than others. He set it on the table in front of her without comment. The return address was the Territorial Commissioner's Office, Cheyenne. She opened it. She read it once, then she read it again. Because the first time through, she had not trusted her own comprehension. The letter informed her that, in connection with the reopened investigation into Garrett Simmons's land fraud operation in Cheyenne, the Commissioner's Office had conducted a review of all evidence submitted in the original case document Margaret had filed 2 years ago, which had been preserved in the official record despite the investigation's closure. That review had determined that the original investigation had been improperly closed. The letter further informed her that Garrett Simmons had been taken into custody in Laramie 6 days ago, where he had been attempting to execute a similar scheme under a different company name. His arrest had been facilitated in part by the pattern of evidence that Margaret's original filing had established. At the bottom of the letter, in language that was official and measured, and therefore all the more striking for what it contained, the Commissioner's Office extended a formal acknowledgement that the information Margaret Hale had provided to the Cheyenne Land Office 2 years prior had been accurate, material, and instrumental in the ultimate case against Simmons's operation. They were not quite saying they were sorry. Government offices rarely said they were sorry. But they were saying, in the careful language of official acknowledgement, that she had been right. That she had been right from the beginning. That the thing she had done at considerable personal cost, in good faith with accurate evidence, had mattered, had always mattered, even when it had appeared to disappear into a closed file. She sat very still for a long time. Nathan came in from the yard and saw her face and stopped. "What happened?" he said. She held out the letter. He crossed the room and took it and read it. She watched his face while he read, the careful eyes moving down the page, the slight tightening at the section about Simmons's arrest, the pause at the final paragraph. He looked up. "It's over," she said. "The Cheyenne part. It's been over for 6 days and I didn't know it." He set the letter on the table between them. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about performing the answer, the composed version. The version that said she was relieved and grateful and ready to move forward. She had been performing post versions of answers for 2 years, and she was tired of it. "Like I've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time," she said. "And I've just been told I can put it down. And I can't quite make my arms believe it yet." He sat down off from her. He didn't say anything. He simply sat there and let her have the truth of it without asking her to resolve it faster than it resolved. After a while she said, "2 years, I know," he said. "I walked into 14 towns in 2 years," she said. "I kept everything I owned in that suitcase. I learned to read a room in 30 seconds, who had heard the story, who hadn't, how much time I had before it made everything impossible. She pressed her hands flat on the table. I was so careful. All the time. About everything. You don't have to be that careful anymore, he said. She looked at him. I know, she said. That's what I can't make my arms believe. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just that. No words around it, no explanation. Just the warm and certain weight of his hand over her hands that had been pressed so flat against the table. She looked down at it. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that until Lily came through the door from her afternoon lessons, saw them at the table, and said, with the serene matter-of-factness of a child who has been watching something develop for weeks and is not remotely surprised. Finally, Nathan removed his hand. Margaret removed her hand. They both looked at Lily. I've been waiting, Lily said, hanging up her coat for approximately forever. You're 8 years old, Nathan said. It feels like forever, she said. Margaret made a sound that was entirely a laugh this time, full and unguarded, and Nathan put his face briefly in his hand, and Lily sat down and asked what was for supper with the complete satisfaction of a person who has just seen something resolved correctly. The Cheyenne hearing was 4 days later. Margaret traveled with Nathan, Burl, riding behind with the documents secured in a locked case that Margaret had chemished from the saddle maker on Main Street, the first thing she had spent money on in Red Willow Creek that was not strictly necessary. And it had felt like a declaration of some kind. The courtroom was smaller than she had expected and more formal than the Frontier suggested it should be. Judge Horace Alcott was a thin man of 60, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades listening to people tell him what they needed him to believe, and who had consequently developed excellent instincts for the difference between what was said and what was true. He looked at Margaret when she was sworn in with the directness of a man taking a first measurement. She looked back at him with the directness of a woman who had nothing left to hide. The testimony took 3 hours. She walked through the document section by section, explaining her methodology, citing each record, tracing the pattern of underpayments across 14 months with the precision she had built into every page. The lawyer representing the territorial commissioner asked clear questions and let her answers stand without interruption. Dawson's attorney, not Featherstone, who was occupied with his own legal difficulties in Cheyenne, but a younger man who had clearly been hired in a hurry, tried twice to introduce questions about her history. About Cheyenne, about the Simmons case. Judge Alcott stopped him both times. The Simmons case, he said, on the second attempt, has been adjudicated in a direction that does not support the implication you are pursuing. Counselor, move to something relevant. Dawson's attorney moved on. When the testimony was complete and Margaret stepped down, Nathan was watching her from the galley, with an expression she had not seen on him before, something beyond the careful steadiness, something that was openly proud, the look of a man watching someone he cares for do something extraordinary and not trying to contain what he feels about it. She sat beside him. He said very quietly, "You were remarkable. I was accurate," she said. "Same thing," he said. Judge Alcott's ruling came 2 days later, delivered in the efficient manner of a man who had seen the evidence and found it conclusive. Meridian Holdings was dissolved. Its acquired properties and grazing rights were to be returned to their original owners, or compensated at fair market value from Dawson's seized assets. Nathan Cole was to receive full restitution for the documented underpayments, plus legal interest. 6 other ranchers in the area received similar judgments. Dawson was remanded for criminal proceedings on fraud charges. His attorney said very little at that point, which was appropriate because there was very little useful to say. Burl, who had been sitting in the gallery throughout, said on the courthouse steps afterward, 12 years I've worked for that ranch. First time I've ever seen justice move faster than a land dispute. It moved, Nathan said. That's what matters. He looked at Margaret. She looked at the Cheyenne street, wide and cold in the November air, full of people moving through their ordinary business, none of them knowing or caring that something had just been corrected that had been wrong for 2 years. "Let's go home," she said. It was the first time she had called it that. She heard herself say it and did not take it back. Nathan heard it too. She could tell by the quality of his stillness beside her. "Let's go home," he said. They rode back to Red Willow Creek with the documents in their locked case and the ruling in Nathan's coat pocket, and the particular lightness of people who have been carrying weight and have legally, officially, documentably set it down. The town knew before they arrived. News moved fast in a place that small, carried by the telegraph and by Gus Pratt, who had attended the hearing as an interested party and had ridden hard to get back ahead of them with the verdict. When Nathan's wagon came up the main street, John Hargrove was standing outside the general store, a different general store owner now, the original one, having quietly reconsidered his position some weeks back, and he raised his hand in the particular greeting of a man acknowledging something more than hello. Ellen Hargrove was beside him, and she called out, "Miss Hale, come to dinner Friday. I'm making the good pie." Margaret called back, "I'll be there." Clara Finch was not on the street. She was reportedly at home, and had been at home quite a lot since the Sunday that Pastor Wells had preached his sermon, and the town had largely decided to let her stay there as long as she needed to reconstruct her opinions. Pastor Wells was outside the church, and he simply nodded at Margaret as they passed, a nod that contained considerable precision. She nodded back. Jim Alderman came out of the land office and shook Nathan's hand and said, "Good result. Good work got us there," Nathan said. Alderman looked at Margaret. "You want a job?" he said. "Officially. The land office has needed a proper bookkeeper for 3 years." She opened her mouth. "She's employed," Nathan said. Alderman grinned. "Thought so." He went back inside. Margaret looked at Nathan. "Employed," she said. "For the foreseeable future," he said. "The ranch books don't keep themselves." "You could have asked me," she said. "I'm asking you now," he said. "Would you like to continue keeping the books for the coal ranch at a proper wage, with the spare room at the back, and 3 scoops of coffee every morning?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I would." He nodded once. The wagon moved on down the street toward home. The weeks that followed had the quality of something settling, not the forced settling of a thing pushed into a space it doesn't quite fit, but the natural settling of water finding its level. Margaret was still in the spare room. She and Nathan still sat across the table from each other in the evenings. But the quality of the space between them had changed, become less careful, less calculated, more like the space between people who have agreed, without formal discussion, on what they are to each other, and are simply inhabiting that agreement. She started teaching Lily arithmetic in the afternoons, not because anyone asked her to, but because she noticed that the girl had the same kind of mind for numbers that Margaret had had at her age, quick and spatial and interested in the way things balanced, and because Lily asked one afternoon why letters in equations stood for numbers, and Margaret started explaining, and they were still at it an hour later, both of them deep in the satisfaction of something that made sense. Nathan came in from the field one afternoon and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the two of them at the table, with papers covered in figures. Lily's head bent close to Margaret's as she worked through a problem. He did not interrupt. He made coffee with 3 scoops and set a cup at each of their elbows and went to his end of the table and did his own work. And nobody said anything about it, and the afternoon was complete in a way that required nothing added to it. The first real snow came in December. Margaret had been at the coal ranch for just over 3 months. She knew this because she had the supply records organized by month, and the date was not abstract to her, was anchored to specific events: the week the hearing was held, the week the restitution payment cleared through Frank Mead's bank, the week she had finally written a letter to a woman in Ohio who had been her father's neighbor and who was the closest thing to family she had, and who had not heard from her in over a year. The snow changed the quality of everything: the sound of the house, the rhythm of the days, the particular closed-in closeness of people who share a space, and have decided to be glad about it, rather than merely tolerant. Lily took the snow as a personal gift. She was outside within minutes of it starting. and her voice carried through the walls of the house in the way that a happy child's voice does, filling more space than seems physically possible. Nathan stood at the window, not looking out, in the way he sometimes stood at windows, and said, "She does this every year. The first snow. She loves it," Margaret said. "She loves it because her mother loved it," he said. "Clara always said the first snow meant everything was starting over." He paused. "I used to hate it for that reason. The starting over part." He turned from the window. "I don't hate it anymore." She looked at him. He crossed the room to where she was standing, and he stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly, and he looked at her with his direct and unhurried gaze and said, "I want to ask you something." Her heart moved in a way that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it, the feeling of standing at the edge of something that matters enormously. "Ask," she said. "I know you said you need time," he said. "I know you need to come to things slowly. I'm not asking you to change that." He paused. "I'm asking if you can tell me not now, not today. Whenever you know it clearly, whether this is a place you see yourself staying. Not just the ranch. Not just the job." His hands pressed together. The gesture Lily had named the tell he never managed to suppress when he felt something completely. "Whether you see yourself staying with me." She looked at his hands. She looked at his face. She thought about what it had cost to walk into this town. She thought about the boarding house door, and the rain and burl picket, and a man bent over a ledger book who had looked at her as though she were a person, and not a problem. She thought about a child with her father's careful eyes saying 3 scoops at 2 in the morning. She thought about 2 years of carrying a suitcase with a brunt latch, held closed with rope, and a lamp that was always full when she came to work late, and a hand placed over hers with no words around it. She thought about what it meant to be seen correctly. Not perfectly, not without complication, but correctly, to have someone look at the whole of who you were and say, "Yes, that is what I want beside me." She reached up and put her hand against his face, and he went very still, the way he went still when something mattered. And she looked at him for a long moment before she spoke. "I'm already staying," she said. "I decided that a long time ago. I was just making sure you knew what you were asking for." He turned his face slightly into her hand. "I know exactly what I'm asking for," he said. "A woman with a broken suitcase and a reputation that half this county spent 2 months trying to destroy," she said. "A woman," he said, "who sat at my table for 8 days and gave me back the truth of my own accounts and saved my daughter's life and told Clara Finch to leave my house and stood in a territorial courthouse and made every number she'd ever written defend itself and won." He paused. "Yes, that is exactly what I'm asking for." She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder. And he put his arms around her, and they stood like that, in the quiet house with the snow falling outside, and Lily's voice coming through the walls. And it was nothing like the stories people told about love, nothing grand, nothing performed, nothing that would make a good speech. It was just 2 people who had each been alone in their own particular way, standing in a warm room holding on. The door opened. Lily came in, trailing cold air and the particular smell of snow, and said, "It's really coming down out there." "Oh." She looked at them. She looked at the general configuration of the situation with the comprehensive assessment of a child who misses nothing. "Good," she said, and hung up her coat. Finally, she added, which appeared to be her considered opinion on most developments she approved of. "You say that a great deal," Margaret said. "Because things take a very long time," Lily said. Going to the stove to warm her hands. "Papa took 4 years to fix the porch step. I fixed it last spring," Nathan said. 4 years, Lily repeated. Margaret made a sound that was entirely a laugh. Nathan looked at her laughing, and the look on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on it, open and warm and entirely certain. The face of a man who has found exactly what he needed and recognizes it completely. Christmas came to the Cole Ranch with a fullness it had apparently been missing for some years. Ellen Hargrove organized a community dinner at the church hall, and Margaret helped with the cooking, and Lily sang in the children's chorus that Pastor Wells conducted with the focused energy of a man who takes music seriously. Gus Pratt brought his fiddle. His wife Clara, still distinguishing herself from the other Clara with cheerful persistence, danced with her husband until he was winded and then kept dancing with Ellen Hargrove's youngest son. Nathan did not dance. He sat beside Margaret at the long table with his shoulder close to hers and watched his daughter sing with the expression of a man whose heart was very full and who was not ashamed of the fact. "She has her mother's voice," he said. "She has her father's certainty," Margaret said. "The way she holds a note. Like she's decided it belongs to her." He looked at her. "I do that," he said. "You do everything like that," she said. "Like you've decided it, and you're not revisiting the decision." He was quiet for a moment, watching Lily. "I've decided you," he said. She looked at him. "I decided you somewhere around the third day," he said. "I just needed to give you time to catch up." She thought about arguing with the timeline. She thought about pointing out that she had been operating under considerable uncertainty for most of the past 3 months. She thought about a great many things she could say. Instead she said, "I caught up." "I noticed," he said. The fiddle started up again, and Lily appeared in front of them, demanding that Margaret dance with her. And Margaret stood up and took the girl's hands, and they danced in the way of someone who learned dancing practically, rather than formally, with more enthusiasm than precision, and Lily laughed. And the hall was warm and full of people, and the Wyoming winter pressed against the walls, outside, and found nothing to get through. In February, Nathan drove her to the land office. Not Alderman's land office in Red Willow Creek, the territorial office in Cheyenne, which handled the specific kind of paperwork that made one kind of arrangement into another kind. She had told him she needed time, and she had taken it. 4 months of ordinary days, of the house and the work, and Lily's arithmetic lessons, and Ellen Hargrove's good pie, and the ranch hands, who had gone from cautious to comfortable to genuinely respectful in the way of people who take their cue from the man they work for, and now took their cue from her as well. 4 months was enough. She had known it was enough the way she knew when a column of numbers was complete, not because she'd decided to stop adding, but because the total was right. You could feel when a total was right. The paperwork was not romantic. Legal documents rarely were. The clerk behind the desk was efficient and incurious, and the signatures required were straightforward, and the whole business took less than 30 minutes. But when they walked out of that office into the February cold, Nathan Cole offered her his arm, and Margaret Hale took it. And she was Margaret Cole, and it was as simple and as enormous as that. She held his arm on the street and thought about the boarding house door she had knocked on in the rain. She thought about standing on that muddy street with her broken suitcase and the whole town watching from dry windows. She thought about Burl Pickett holding a horse in the rain, saying, "You're welcome to ride along if you want work." She thought about a door opening. She thought about the man behind it, bent over his ledger book, looking up with careful eyes. She thought, "I have been moving toward this my whole life, and I did not know it until I was already here." 3 scoops, she said. Nathan looked at her. "When we get back," she said. "I want coffee with 3 scoops, and I want to sit at the table and not look at any numbers for the rest of the day." "We can do that," he said. "And I want Lily to teach me that song she's been working on," she said. "The one she keeps humming but won't tell me the words to yet. She's been practicing it for 2 weeks, he said. She said she wanted it to be right before she sang it for you." Margaret stopped walking. "She's been practicing it for me," she said. She said, Nathan said, with the quiet warmth of a man delivering something he knows will matter, that it was the song her mother used to sing, and that she thought you should know it. She stood on the Cheyenne street in the February cold and pressed her free hand briefly over her eyes. And Nathan waited with his arm steady under her hand. And when she was ready, she looked up and he was there. Exactly where he had been, exactly where he always was. "Let's go home," she said. And they went. The woman who had arrived in Red Willow Creek with a broken suitcase and a ruined name and nothing but the truth she refused to put down. That woman went home to a house with a lamp in the window and a child who had saved a song for her and a man who had opened a door in the rain without knowing that he was also, in that same moment, opening everything that came after. She had not found a perfect life. She had found something that was real and earned and chosen by her and chosen by the people who looked at who she was and said yes, deliberately, with full knowledge, without reservation. And that in the end was not the life she had lost. That was the life she had always been worth having and had finally at last come home to claim.